All right. Hey, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Manny, and welcome to another industry session. Today, we are privileged, we're honored to have the man, Johan Lithvall, joining us. You
Perfect pronunciation.
There you
Perfect.
go. There
We
you go.
practiced.
I
Turned out
stayed up all
perfect.
night looking into the mirror, practicing it, making sure,
Spot
but
on.
exactly. But we're really lucky to have him. I'm going to just have him kind of introduce himself and then give us, just an overview of his workflow as it relates to creating the amazing grooming and hairstyle that he does so well. So without further ado, Johan, if you could introduce yourself to this amazing audience.
Yeah. All right. First off, thank you guys so much for joining today. I'm surprised that this many people have this interest in games for hair. That was definitely not the case a few years ago when I started, but it's really cool to see. So my name is Johan, and I make hair for a living, basically. I started working at Guerrilla Games in Amsterdam some 4.5 years ago, 4.5. Started off as an intern. I wanted to do characters at the time, just regular character artist. So that's what I did during the DLC for Killzone Shadowfall. Just worked regular characters. And then towards the end of my internship, my art director at the time, Dan Calvert, he approached me and asked if I wanted to focus on hair because we were going to make this new game, Horizon. It was still in pre-production at the time. And he said that we're going to have a lot of crazy hairstyles, basically. And we would love for you to just fully dedicate yourself in this area and, see what you make of it. Because we didn't really have a lot of tech at the time. Like for Killzone, for instance, a lot of the characters, they just wore hats, helmets, hats, which is a bit unfortunate because that's pretty common actually in the games industry. A lot of the times, at least with some of the more complex looking hairstyles, they tend to be avoided for a number of reasons. But that was not the case for Horizon, and I basically just started to experiment a lot. It took me about like 1.5 up to 2 years before I felt a little bit more comfortable making hair. And all of this time was just spent in the studio, just testing, see what works. And then it, accumulated into me making the hair for Horizon, for the main character, some of the other story NPCs, and then also working on this pipeline, which is part of what I wanted to show today. That we had outsourcing, we taught outsourcing how to do it as well, so they could help us out and make a lot of assets basically for Horizon. So that was my time doing Guerrilla Games. When we came close to finishing the game, I went back to Sweden, where I'm from, back to Stockholm, and started working for Starbase Studios in Stockholm. I worked on The Walking Dead, which is yet to be released. Also doing hair for about a year. And then towards the beginning of this year, I just quit. It was a great studio, nothing against the studio, but I felt like I wanted to, try freelancing, try a bit of consulting, and I also wanted to travel more. So basically that's what I do now. I just travel around. I don't really have like a fixed office back home. So I've been spending the last 6 months going to, Bali for a few months, Ecuador, Tokyo, Morocco, went to San Francisco, both for work and also just to, have a nice scenery when I'm sitting and making hair all day.
You have such a tough life, man.
It's
I don't know how
it's
you do it.
I've been through a lot, this
Yeah,
year.
yeah.
A lot of sunshine, and yet I'm not that, tanned. So not everyone has it easy, but we make do. I get a lot of freckles though, so that's
There
something.
you go. There you go. It bounces out.
Yeah.
Cool. So So yeah, so let's take everybody through, your pipeline and just your overall workflow.
Yeah. So we can start with um, having a look at some references. So I'm going to go through the references that I used to make this model, which is the model that is used in the CGMA course. Um, so basically, when I start with any given sort of hair assets, having real-life references is crucial. I took a conscious decision some time ago that I wouldn't really look a lot at other artists' work when it came to making hair. Not because it's bad or anything. A lot of artists have their own techniques with varying results. But even if you're trying to copy someone else, the good parts of their project, you're also going to copy some of their mistakes. And besides, when it comes to game hair, it hasn't really been pushed as far as it could, especially if you compare it to films, for instance. So I feel like just having a look at real life references is key, to making something that ends up looking like actual hair. So we just have a lot of references in here. I just start off like a full day almost, just scouting the web for various images. And then as I start to accumulate all of these images, I start to kind of organize them into different reference images, kind of collages. So I typically divide it into 3 different types of reference images that I always, have on the side as I work on the assets. So the first one is details. We got structures and we got style. So it's basically a way for me to kind of start from here and then zoom in to the hair, the way the hair is constructed, and just have like all the detail levels in the reference sheets. So when it comes to the style, as the name suggests, that's the one that's closest to the actual model that I want to make. In a perfect world, you would find, the one hairstyle on Google Images, and you would have it from all angles, and it would be perfect, high res. You wouldn't need to do any of this. Unfortunately, that's not usually the case. So you're just gonna have to find different aspects of, reference images as you go, and then kind of combine them as you go. But for me, I typically try to keep the style references as close to the final model as possible. So for instance, I wanted to have this kind of hair in the back being wavy, kind of long. I wanted to have some braids, all of these things. And then as we zoom in a little bit more, because sometimes you can find a reference image that doesn't necessarily represent the model that you want to make in the end, but it could have some pretty cool aspects that you just want to put into your hair model. So that's where structures come in. So for instance, if we just have a look at this image, I really like the way that the hair was kind of going into this braided, or I guess twisted parts. So this is something that I wanted to copy, but like I said, this image doesn't necessarily represent the final hairstyle. It's just one of the smaller things. Same here. I really like the twisted hair here compared to, compared to the braided hair. So I wanted to give that a go. So I just wanted to have this kind of twisted hair. I really like the way the roots were kind of bent, for instance, over here. So that's something that I also wanted to put into my model. And then lastly, we got details. And details doesn't necessarily have to do anything at all with the way that the hair is constructed in comparison to what you want your final model to be. But the main qualification of the details ones is that they have to be super high res. So I actually have even more high res images of these just individually, but you really want to be able to zoom in, as far as possible and study the way that all of these individual hair clumps are actually constructed. Because when I approach any given hairstyle, I always try to see it in terms of shapes. The same way you would create a character, it has to look good from afar, And as you come closer, you should start focusing on different aspects of the character as you go more into detail, basically. So you need to support all these detail levels in a game. So we can, for instance, just zoom in here and quite easily see the way that the hair is being constructed here. We got, all of these smaller sub-clumps attached to these larger clumps, for instance. So that's something that we want to try to implement into our model. So, and we also have a little bit about, for instance, flyaways, which is interesting. Let's have a look at. Let's zoom up. So we can just have a quick look and see that, all of these individual hairs, they don't necessarily behave in the same way that the rest of the hair does. So that's also something that we want to try to incorporate into our model. So that's a bit about references. And once you have your reference sheets in order, obviously it's time to start making the model. And you would start off by creating textures. So I'm not going to go into any xgen stuff today because, for one, we just don't have time for it. But also, most importantly, like a lot of this information is available online, through tutorials and whatnot. So the stuff that I'm doing in xgen is not by any means, super specific to my pipeline. It's very generic. I actually try to minimize time spent in xgen as much as possible, because even if it's a great tool, it's a bit of a time sink. So you can just spend a lot of time in there trying to get the perfect arrangements for your hair, for your texture. But what I find is it's much easier to just output a bunch of splines that somewhat correlates to the shapes you want to put into the hair, and then you just hand modify them afterwards in Maya. So it's just a preference for me. But I just wanted to show you this scene because this is a good example of what I would output from xgen, which is basically these ones. And then obviously these splines would later be converted to geometry and then baked into textures, which is what we're going to have a look at as well. But yeah, so if we just compare these upper ones here, like I said, that's the ones that I tend to export something similar to this. It has more to do with just getting structure and feel of hair. So seeing as we're looking at splines here, there's no shading, we can't really judge if it looks good or not. But what I just end up doing is that I grab a few of these and I create my sets of hair textures, basically. Just all of these clumps. And all of these clumps have different purposes. So we're also going to have a look at a bit later on some examples for hair models that utilize some of these textures, but also other textures. And I tend to build them in different layers. Like any given hair asset that I do is always built in these layers. And each layer should have a set of qualifications that you need to meet that you can then proceed to the next layer, next layer, next layer. So for instance, for the blockout layer, like I said, we're going to have a look at this later, but just quickly explaining, like the blockout layer is supposed to act as a blocker. So we need to have this kind of thicker hair strands that don't really have a lot of transparency to them, for instance. And then as we move up in layers, we want to get smaller and smaller in detail level. But not just having, that doesn't necessarily mean that you just reduce the amount of splines and add a lot more shape to them. To me personally, I try to restrict the amount of shape that I put into my hair textures, because if I look at a lot of hair assets for games today, what I tend to see studios do is that they focus a little bit too much on the texture, like adding too much shape into the actual texture to convey what sort of hairstyle that they're making. For instance, if you're making curly hair, I've seen a lot of examples where an artist would make the actual hair texture curly. But if you do that, I feel like you're kind of restricting yourself, because you're going to get a very repetitive result from doing that, because you're just going to, place the same sort of shaped hair texture all over your model with some variance to it. And besides, today we get a little bit more of a performance budget that we can use for characters, that we can also use for hair. And also the fact that vertices today isn't really that expensive anymore. It has performance has a lot more to do with shader stuff, like overdraw, for instance. So that means we can add more shape into the actual hair cards themselves to create the shape that we want for each individual piece, and instead keep the texture quite generic. One thing that I do focus on, though, is trying to create these kind of negative spaces in the texture, especially for the ones that are supposed to be further on top in terms of layering, because there's a number of reasons that I do that. One of the most important ones is the fact that since we're using Unreal for the modeling, the CGMA course, a lot of studios use Unreal. It's kind of the standard go-to engine nowadays. So if we just look at their hair shader, they don't really have, actual transparency in their hair shader. They're just using dithering plus temporal anti-aliasing to create something that, feels soft but isn't actually transparent. So that means we can't stack like a bunch of hairs on top of each other and then make the top layer more transparent. So instead, we need these kind of negative spaces so we can look in between the hair cards to give a sense of depth to the hair, basically. These negative spaces also go into the next stage, which is what I'm about to show. But yeah, that's basically one of the things that I think about when I make my hair textures. The next step after this, once again, super kind of basic, I guess, commonly used. You just export these, or you convert them rather, to geometry, and then you would bake them into your textures. So it depends a lot on your game's engine, the engine that you use. Once again, we're using Unreal, so I'm just going to focus on that. And in Unreal, we don't actually use like albedo, for instance. We don't have an albedo texture. We don't even have a normal map. So a lot of the shading in Unreal derives from some parameters, but also individual bakes, basically, that we need. So here's an example of one hair texture. I actually think it's the same one. So I just bake out like a ID map. That's one of the textures. Height map, this one. We got a ramp to make some color adjustments to the roots. And then the alpha, which is this one. And then what I tend to do is just combine them into one texture. So you just put one in each individual channel. Because once again, like vertices today is not super important to keep track of. It has a lot more to do with shading, but also texture memory. So the more you can reduce texture memory, the better. So I end up just having one 32-bit TJ hair texture. So that's a bit about that. The next step, basically, you have your hair textures picked out. You just put them into Maya. And in Maya, I just assign them to these polygon sheets, nothing out of the ordinary, just flat planes. But what I then tend to do is, because once again, I try to focus on, like when I think about hair, I think about it more as a volume rather than a surface. So it needs to feel like, like a volume, but you shouldn't really be able to pinpoint individual cards. And one way to kind of get away from that is to create hair chunks using your hair textures. And then you would just place like individual hair chunks on your model instead. So that way you get a lot for free, basically, when you actually make your hair model. You don't constantly have to think about the volume aspect of it. So even if it does take a bit of time to set this up for each individual project, I feel like it's definitely time well spent, for sure. So basically what I do is I just grab 2 to 3, sometimes 4 for the bigger chunks, hair cards. And then I try to create as many variations as possible using these ones, so that we can use these for different parts of the hair to get a lot of variation. But then once again, we can also bend these into different shapes to get even more variation. So there's virtually no repetition. Hair chunks work from multiple angles as well, which is one of the main points with this. So basically, as you kind of rotate around, this one is only using 2 cards. You shouldn't really be able to see it as individual hair cards. To feel more as like a clump of hair, using as few hair cards as possible. Like this. So I typically just have a base that I put like this. Just have a look from the top here. And then what I typically do is to create this kind of triangular shaped structure. This one is a little bit different, but typically having like this triangular structure gives you the most bang for the buck, basically. You get a lot more flexibility in the way you can view this hair chunk from multiple angles. This is one of the detail ones, just using 2. Doing this is also a good idea because, like I said, Unreal Engine doesn't use normal maps. A lot of the shading comes from different aspects of the texturing process, but also from the model itself. So the face normals, the way that the polygons are facing, plays a huge role in terms of how they're being shaded. So if you have one hair chunk like this, just imagine this sitting on top of the model, you don't necessarily want all of these individual hair strands to be lit at the same time, casting it like a reflection on the same area, because that way it's going to feel really flat, you know. So you want to try to break that up, and by doing these types of hair chunks, you basically change the direction of the face normals for each individual hair chunk. So you instantly get a lot of that for free. Parts of this also comes in when you actually make the model. So the next step after you have all of these is to start making your assets. So we can have a few looks at some hair models that I made, and basically go through all of these layers. So I wanted to show you all of these individual layers and then talk a little bit about what I'm thinking with each individual layer. Is the sound quality okay? No lag or anything?
Can you guys hear Johan pretty well? Is it pretty clear? Yeah, everybody's now reacting to how amazing the hair looks. Okay, so it looks like awesome. Everybody's saying it's all good.
That's perfect.
Great.
All right. So I typically when I make my hair models, I'm using Maya. I typically just turn off all types of shading when I make them, because in Maya, the shading is not going to represent your final outcome by any means. So you might as well just turn it off and visualize the model as is, basically. So if we have a look at this one, we can check the outliner here, and we see that I've divided this model into different parts, and all of these different objects are basically each layer that as a collection creates this asset. So if we hide these ones, it's a bit of what's this called, when it kind of goes through the model, which is a bit unfortunate. However, this is only going to be visible in Maya, so it has to do with the way that Maya deals with sorting, which is vastly different from the way that Unreal deals with sorting. So Maya is basically just using the depth buffer to do that, and it's a little bit wonky, but you won't see this at all in Unreal, so that's good. Anyways, so for some projects I have a scalp. For some projects I don't, and a lot of people ask me, like, when do you need a scalp and when don't you need a scalp? And that's a very tough question to answer, because for me it has purely to do, like, each asset is different basically. For this asset, you know, this was supposed to be this kind of old man, and I wanted it to feel like he had kind of thin looking hair, so we can kind of see pretty far into the roots here, for instance, towards the front, which is a feature that a lot of elderly men have, you know, because your hair starts to get a little more thin, so you want to be able to see a lot more of the roots. But I didn't really want you to see the scalp in the more covered areas. So for this one in particular, I just made a scalp that only covered, you know, the bigger areas here. When it comes to the scalp, I just use the far end of the texture typically. It doesn't really matter as long as, you know, you don't have any transparency in the texture that you're using for your scalp. It doesn't really matter if you make a unique one or if you use any of your hair chunks or hair textures that you use to create the hair chunks, basically. But it's very simple. I just map each individual polygon row to one of these textures. And then I just try to do it in a way where it roughly follows the flow of the hair. Once again, it's not super important because most of the time you're not going to see it, but if you do, it's always nice that, you know, the hairs on the scalp kind of follows the general flow. And then, you know, once you apply shading to it, even if the specular is going to be darkened due to vertex occlusion and stuff, you know, you can still kind of pick it out. So it's nice if you try to make something that follows the general flow. Second one is the blockout layer. So I always tell my students that part of why this pipeline that I've created is a little bit difficult, especially when you start off with it, is the fact that as you're working on your model, you're going to work on something for quite a while that doesn't necessarily look very good. It doesn't look and feel like hair for quite some time, but that's definitely deliberate because, like I mentioned earlier, each individual layer in the hair has specific qualifications that you should meet. Then, you know, you can proceed to the next one, next one, next one. And one of the qualifications for the blockouts is definitely not that it should look and feel like hair. The blockout should basically be the next step after the scalp. So you start to block in the basic shapes of the hair. I purely see shapes at this point. I'm just focusing on, you know, the main structures of the hair. I'm thinking about the volumes, the flow, like the general flow. I don't care at all about having breakups. Silhouettes is pretty much non-existent. I just need something that can act as a base, you know, something that I can work off of and then add to that eventually turns into something that looks and feel like hair. The second layer is where it starts to feel a little bit more like hair. So looking at this, it might feel a little bit noisy and busy, And then you might go like, but doesn't this make the asset, super expensive? Because you already said that, the shader is a part of it that makes it the most expensive. So the way that I add these layers is I try not to stack each layer on top of each other. Like the hair chunks within each layer, I try not to stack them on top of each other. So once again, seeing as we don't have any proper transparency in Engine, we need to utilize the negative spaces between each individual hair chunk to be able to, see through the different layers of the hair. Because if you completely cover up one layer with a layer above, there's no point in having that layer to begin with. So if we just look at this one, even if there's quite a lot of hair chunks in this, we get a lot of negative spaces in here. There's not really any areas where we have a ton of hair chunks stacked on top of each other. Let's see, I can actually try doing this. Oh, doesn't really work, but hopefully the idea comes across. At this point, I'm starting to introduce a little bit more of a silhouette, but the silhouette typically takes most place in the flyaways layer. So flyaways layer could both be individual hairs, just single strands, but also just smaller hair chunks in general, just details. Basically, all the bigger shapes are supposed to take place in the second layer or the blockout layer. So the flyaways are purely for smaller details, something that makes it look nice and fuzzy once you zoom into the assets. So for instance, this one is in the flyaways layer, but then as you zoom out and imagine this being in game, you could quite easily just remove this layer completely without it affecting the shading of the model too much. And that would effectively make it much less expensive as well, because loading, as we all know, and love and hate, is super important for games. So one of the ways that you can load it is not just to reduce the poly count by removing edges. It's also to completely remove aspects of the hair as you kind of zoom out. And the flyaways is definitely the first one to go. Yeah, and basically that applies to all hair models that I make. The general workflow doesn't necessarily change a lot depending on model. There's always some edge cases. So for instance, with this one, we can have a look at the texture here. I figured that I needed one specific piece for this asset, where I actually did end up putting a lot of shape into the texture instead of trying to create this shape using polygons. Because having kind of curly hair with these types of chunks and then bend them in place, adding more subdivisions as you go, doesn't necessarily make it super expensive. But if you want to make this super rounded shape, you're going to need a lot of subdivisions to achieve that. So I figured I might as well just do that as a separate thing.
That is just gorgeous. It looks like you just scanned someone's hair. Beautiful work.
They're being used here, basically. And once again, we can look at these individual layers here. We see that none of these layers are really, being overlaid on top of each other too much within each layer. So once again, this asset has a scalp. Like I said, not all assets do, but in this case, I figured it was a good idea, especially for this back portion here. And then as we move up, we got the blockouts. So seeing as I'm using a scalp for this asset, I want to be able to utilize even the scalp as much as possible, because I've already spent some polygons I've already made sure that it doesn't intersect with the head. So it's all nice and tidy. So I might as well show it off, you know. So in this case, you can actually see through parts of the block out as well. But obviously, if you're not using a scalp, you might not want to do that. So in that case, I would probably make this a little bit more dense, or at the very least use a texture that has less negative space in it. So you wouldn't really get all of this. And then second layer. For this asset in particular, I thought it was interesting because, you know, this hairstyle specifically is something that you tend to see a lot in games, which is this, you know, a regular hair bun. And the reason why you tend to see it a lot is because you don't need to apply a lot of animation to it. It's just a very simple hairstyle to create. But then you can also have it rigid without anyone really noticing. So knowing these things, you know, when you start seeing a ton of these in different games, you know, it starts to feel a little bit lazy. So for this one in particular, I wanted to do this hairstyle because that was a task that I was given for a project, but I wanted to add a little bit more to it. So in this case, I wanted it to feel a little bit more messy, a little bit more broken up, start applying more gravity to the hairs. So the majority of the hair chunks, especially the ones we see here in the blockouts, they're quite neat. They all tend to, you know, roughly follow this kind of straight-looking shape, which means to me that they're just firmly attached to the bun in the back. And then as we move on up in the layers and make the hair chunks smaller, more of these hair chunks are going to start falling out of these structures. And what's interesting is that then you can actually apply physics to these individual hair chunks and just do that as kind of like a secondary motion or secondary animation type of thing for your hair asset. But once again, we can clearly see that we have a lot of negative spaces here. Not really having a lot of hair chunks, you know, overlaying each other, which does minimize overdraw. And then lastly, we got the flyaways. So the flyaways for this one are purely just single strands. And put it all together. And we get this. For example, all of these behave in the same way. You know, they're all built in these layers. This one in particular, I actually didn't combine the layers, so I won't be able to show that. But yeah, that's the general process that I go through when I assemble these models.
Man, I gotta say that is the most thorough overview of a pipeline that we've ever had. That was amazing. I think people. It's. I think we should have charged. That was great. That was great. All right, perfect. So let's just jump into some of the questions. I know we had several questions prepped beforehand.
Oh, I actually did have one last thing.
Go ahead.
That I wanted to show. So this one is really a real quick one. But basically, especially when you're working with Unreal Engine, the last step, like you finish the model, everything's done, you have it, you know, in the layers. The last thing is to apply vertex occlusion to the hair. So vertex occlusion is a parameter that Unreal can pick up in the shader and then just darken basically the lower layers. So seeing as we're using the negative spaces and we can see, you know, all the individual layers, the effect of vertex occlusion becomes more apparent. So it's quite an important aspect of the hair, I guess. Just wanted to show quickly like what that would look like, but also something that I did for a project. So sometimes you don't necessarily need to have a lot of occlusion in the hair, because the hair itself, if you would see it in real life, wouldn't have a lot of occlusion in it. So for instance, we take this old man, like, as I said, his hair is quite thin. So you don't get a lot of this volume in the hair, which then doesn't translate to a lot of occlusion. But for this one in particular, that I thought was interesting, is that instead of using vertex occlusion, we just took the individual channels, the RGB channel, and then colorized them individually, and then if you modify the hair shader in Unreal to pick up the individual channels instead of all of the channels, you can colorize different aspects of the hair model individually. So for this old man, we wanted the front part here, that's kind of yellowish green, to be kind of silverish grayish, and then as it goes back, we want it to be a little bit darker, a little bit more colorized, I guess. So then you can just colorize the front parts with one vertex color, colorize the back part with one vertex color. I think I ended up doing the eyebrows in one. I can't really remember. But yeah, so that way you can basically not just have root and tip color, but you can also have different elements on the model can have different colors, basically.
Cool. Great.
That's it.
Cool. So the first question from Renee. So do you make the entire hair from those hair strand combinations, or are those extra from xgen conversion?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah. So do you make the entire hair from only from those hair strand combinations, or are those extras from xgen conversions?
No, so I'm just using these chunks, basically. So these hair chunks you see here are the hair chunks that I use to make this one. So the xgen portion of the pipeline is just in the beginning. It's purely a way for me to output a bunch of splines that, when you look at them together, they kind of feel like hair. But then I quickly, output these into geometries, bake it, and then carry on with creating the hair chunks and then place the hair chunks. So xgen doesn't really have any more space in the pipeline other than just outputting splines, basically.
Cool. So Nat wants to know, how do you go about shaping multiple hair planes?
Let's go back here. So as we can see here with the hair chunks, one thing that is important is, a lot of these hair cards are intersecting with each other, as you can see. And it's super important that you never intersect portions of the hair texture where there's actually hair in the texture with other parts of another plane with texture applied to it that has hair in the same position. So if I was to take this guy here and then duplicate it, just rotate it, maybe do a bit of this, we can already see here that these are being shaded differently from one another. Turn off flat lighting, can't really see that. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that when you put this into Unreal Engine and then actually apply some specularity to this, this is going to become even more apparent. So what ends up happening is that you can have a very hard looking specular, sharp one here on this plane, and then it's going to cut off, which looks very artificial. It doesn't look natural, obviously. So you want to try to avoid that, which is also why we have these negative spaces in the texture. So we try to use the negative spaces in the texture to, when we make the chunks, to have the hairs kind of go in and out without actually intersecting with each other. So looking at this guy here, you know, if we look really close here, none of these hairs actually intersects with each other, which means that you could apply, you know, full specularity to this plane in engine without it looking weird, you know, because you're not going to get those kind of sharp breaks.
Cool, man. We're gonna try our best, guys, to get to as many of these questions as possible. But there's a lot of questions. So can you give me an example of converting splines to planes for the hair? Is that something realistically, you know, you could go over, not even necessarily go over, but you can answer in a couple of minutes, Johan, or should we save that for maybe part 2 later on?
I mean, I can just super quickly show you, because that part of the pipeline, I mean, there's nothing really fancy about it. I literally just make a plane and then place it in the position of the hair chunk, like this, and then, you know, I bake it. So what's important is that once you assemble your hair chunks, I tend not to add subdivisions to the cards themselves. Like this one has subdivisions, I'm not sure why, but these ones doesn't. Because when I create the hair chunks, I might want to take this guy and this guy, right? And then I want to put this one in here, do this. Then it might be like, okay, for instance, in this part here, there's actually some hairs that are intersecting with each other. So I might just want to move this down a bit. So these no longer, you know, are subdivided the same way, which is totally fine, because once you've finished your hair chunk, I just subdivide the hair chunk evenly. So to go back to the original questions, like how you would adjust these, is that I would add these subdivisions once the hair chunk is finished. And then I can shape this hair chunk as a unit without adding weird kinks to different portions of the hair chunk. And the way that I typically do it is by using deformers. So I would just add deformers to this, because if you use soft selects, you basically kind of break the construction of these. So if I wanted this shape, you know, this one would look more like this. This one would be more like this. But so it's kind of like a destructive workflow. But with deformers, that's not really the case. So if I just bend this one real quick, you can see that the distribution of the polygons are much better. So for each individual hair chunk, I just create bend modifiers, and then you know, just work my way down from the roots. Maybe the first one, I place it like here. And I, for instance, in this particular case, I only want there to be a bend like here. So I would go in and adjust like this, just add a new one. Then make sure that as I go from root to tip, I don't add new modifications to the work that I've already done. So I can just, you know, remove the high bound, and then it's only going to affect the bottom portion here. And once again, it's non-destructive, so all geometries look fine. Another interesting part that I typically do with any given hair chunk is I start off with applying a twist modifier, and then a bend modifier. And then I go in and adjust it using the bend modifiers until I have the shape that I want for this hair chunk. But seeing as the different types of modifiers in Maya are being stacked in the channel box in Maya, and they're being stacked the way you add them. So that means that even if I add shape to this bend modifier that I added after the twist modifier, I can still go in and add twist to this afterwards. So if you just add a tiny amount, like a small amount of twist to all your hair chunks, you're going to alter the face normals, once again, of the geometry, which means that, say that this is the shape that we want for this hair chunk, right? It has a lot of curvature from this angle, but nothing from this angle, which means that if I didn't add the twist and we have a light shining on this piece of geometry, the whole hair chunk would be instantly lit from certain angles because all of these normals are facing the same way. Whereas if you add this twist modifier, you're changing basically the oops, no one. You're changing the normals, which means that the specular is only going to be applied to parts of the hair chunk. So it kind of breaks it up a little bit. It's one of these like secondary effects. That was a very long answer. Sorry.
Yeah, it sure was. The person who asked it definitely appreciates that. So Deborah wants to know, how do you deal with hair with a lot of volume, like curly hair? You don't have to demo that, Johan.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the same way as I would approach any other model. You just build it in layers. So when it came to this one, this model has a lot of curvature to it. So I just start off with a blockout and I add as much curvature to it as needed. And then as I go up in the layers, it's more about breaking up the layers below. So you don't get this, you can't really follow each individual hair card as it travels down the hair. You just want to see it as a volume of individual hairs, basically. So for each new layer, I just adjust the shape a bit where it looks like it still belongs to the bigger hair chunks underneath, but they just kind of do their own thing a little bit. And then the next layer is kind of doing their own thing a little bit more. And then, yeah, you go by that way.
Can you show the brow for the female character or any of the characters? Someone wanted to just see a close-up look of what the brows look like.
So this is super simple. I've actually tried quite a few different variations on how to go by doing this to get a good result in Unreal. So I had individual cards at one point. I think I actually did for the old man here.
Cool.
But it doesn't look very good if you have the same shader for the hair as you do with the eyebrows. So it actually ends up looking better most of the time if you just have a sheet like this.
Cool. And Johan, we're at that mark. I just want to be mindful of your time. But do you think you do another like 20 minutes or so, or?
No, I'm gonna head out now. So see you guys.
Okay.
Awesome.
As he drops the mic. Exactly.
No, of course. We got all the time in the world.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. So how long speaking of time, how much time does it generally take you to create a character like this? Renee wants.
I think this one took me maybe 7 or 8 work days, probably 7.
Okay.
And this one was a little bit more complex. Probably took me like 2 weeks, I think, work days.
Cool. It's amazing.
So like 10 to 12, I guess, work days.
Yeah. And that's everything, right? Like just shader work, everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, everything. Yeah.
Great. Kerr wants to know, how do you automate the process of placing cards? Like saying using in cloth, or is it just mistakenly just hand placing?
I would love to be able to automate that process. Like, I really would love to automate that process. I've used basically every single hair tool available when it comes to like placing hair cards, but I can't seem to get into enough detail when I do that. So no, unfortunately, just hand placing.
That's just the way it goes, huh?
Yeah.
So someone was wondering if you could show the shader, the Unreal shader for the hairs that you created.
Yeah, for sure. So the hair shader that I'm using here for this project, like it's definitely nothing fancy. Pretty much straight out of the box, the hair shader is being used for the different Unreal projects you can download. So the photorealistic character, I think Meet Mike might have been different because I think they're using splines for it. But this one is using the photorealistic character, which is why I actually wanted to have a look at the Polygon one as well. I haven't done it yet. But yeah, cool. This is basically it.
And Kerr wants to know: do you cover rigging requirements for hair in the course in your class?
We're not going through like the rigging process, but you know, the course is obviously a lot more extensive, seeing as we have a lot more time. So I do talk a lot about, you know, stuff that you need to think about as you make your model that then goes into rigging. One of them being the way you construct your hair chunks, for instance, because if you don't have even subdivisions, you're not going to get even skinning, which means that simulating this would be a pain. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into it, but we don't actually rig the hair in the course. No.
Cool. All right, and Regina wants to know: do you always use Maya for hair modeling, or have you used Zbrush as well?
I've tried Zbrush, yeah. I mean, I guess that could work. I'm just used to Maya. I think you can actually have like planes with transparency and stuff in Zbrush as well. So technically you could do that if you're super comfortable with using Zbrush and the transformation tools, all that, sure. You wouldn't have the bend deformers though, which is super important when I make hair. So yeah, personally, I wouldn't do it, but.
Okay. So speaking of bend deformers, Jen wanted to know if you could really quickly, and you could just explain it, how do you go about bending the cards to the head? I guess you actually basically showed it earlier, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. See if I have some. So this is a little bit of a wonky demonstration because I haven't actually prepared that. But I was saying I'm using the bend deformers to do it, and I always start off with placing the straight plane on the scalp where the roots doesn't penetrate the scalp, but they're just hovering slightly above. So once again, it's perfectly fine if you intersect the geometry into the scalp, like that's not going to matter because shading is not applied to areas where there's no hair. But you do have, you know, you have MIP mapping, for instance, which is something that's widely used for games, which basically makes the texture a bit more blurry as you pan away from the character. And if you start to intersect the actual hairs in the texture with the scalp, you're going to run into the same issue that I was talking about earlier if you start intersecting the individual hairs in the texture when you make the chunks, because you're going to have this sharp break, basically, where the roots are supposed to be attached to the scalp. So you still want to have that MIP mapping applied to like the bottom portion of the roots. So I just place the plane straight, make sure that the roots are fine. And then I just work my way from the roots using the bend modifiers, and then just all the way to the tip. And then as a last step, I usually add a bit of twist. like you mentioned, and that's
Cool.
it.
Great. Do you prepare long hairstyles for the rigging department in any way, or is it just one huge chunk? Elena would like to know.
So it depends, I guess. Usually depends. There's not really like a clear answer to something that I do for all assets. It has a lot more to do with like the complexity of the asset, the length, volume, all of these things, and how much of it is going to be have physics to it, you know, animation. So, for instance, for Alloy for Horizon, the model that I gave to the riggers actually had all the individual layers to it, so that different, you know, animation systems can be applied to different layers of the hair. So like a little bit more animation to the flyaways, less so to like the bigger chunks, basically.
Cool. And butchering his name, Juras wants to know. First off, super insightful. Thanks, Johan. I would like to know, how would you approach creating something like dreadlocks?
Yeah, dreadlocks, that's an interesting one. I've actually done some dreadlocks, both for Horizon, but also for some other projects when I was freelancing. I don't really have an example to show, unfortunately, but I can just quickly say that I feel like in the same way that I keep talking about the face normals of the cards, the texture, you know, make less of an impact the farther you go away from the model. But even as you zoom into it, you know, relying on texture itself to create something as complex as dreadlocks is typically not a good idea. So what a lot of artists tend to do when they make dreadlocks is just to have like this tube-shaped piece of geometry, and then you have a lot of hairs on it, you know, that are messy, curly, what have you. And that would be the dreadlock, and then you have a normal map applied to it. Very straightforward, but if you just zoom out a little bit from the dreadlock, even if you're kind of close to it, you're never going to get away from shading it like a tube. It's always going to be shaded like a tube. Whereas dreadlocks actually have a lot of shape to them, like internal bumps and crevices, you know. So what I tend to do is, and also dreadlocks tend to be twisted, because that's typically how you make dreadlocks. So what I tend to do is just map a very simple looking texture, like a bit of frizziness with the individual hairs, but majority of the hairs are just kind of going downwards. And then I apply that to a tube, regular tube, and then I twist the actual tube geometry to, you know, get the rotation of the hair, which also enables me to use fewer iterations of, or fewer of these dreadlocks, but not get a lot of repetition, because you can have different twists to them. So this way, you know, you're not only getting the twist, the specular is actually going to follow the twist of the hairs, and also you're alternating the face normals, so you don't get that tube-looking shade to your dreadlock. So you try to break that up as much as possible, and then I just go in on a smaller level and kind of adjust the geometry a little bit.
Cool. So Paul wants to know, can you say something about dynamics? How do you attach hairs to your character's head regarding weight?
Regarding weight?
Yeah.
It's a tricky question.
Yeah. I think we could skip on that one. Because I think it's more has to do with rigging.
Yeah, it has a lot more to do with the way you set up your animation system to begin with, and that doesn't really have a lot to do with the engine. It's more like each studio kind of has their own thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a bit tricky.
Yeah. So Michelle is asking, it's an amazing, you know, pipeline that is time consuming. If we, you know, lack that time, can can we purchase some templates to help speed up the process? That is something that's interesting. I never really thought about that. Is that a thing? Can you know, and how feasible would that be? Let's say like for this character here, you know, let's say I have a couple of other, you know, models that are of older gentlemen, right? You know, and I wanted to, you know, utilize the same type of hairstyle or something similar. Is that realistic?
Yeah, for sure. And that's actually one of the benefits with this workflow, because if you keep your texture as general as possible, you can use it for multiple characters, and you're never gonna see it. You know, as long as you adjust the as long as you adjust it to look like a different hairstyle, in the end, it's just a bunch of hairs on a plane, right? So for a lot of projects, I end up using the same texture for multiple characters, which also means that I use the same hair chunks for multiple characters. So, you know, for a project where you actually have a deadline, you need to make a lot of hair models. It makes a lot of sense, at least to me, to spend time in the beginning of it, in the beginning of the project, just make a few hair textures. You might already have some character briefs, know roughly what type of textures you need. And then you make the hair chunks using these textures, and then you can basically make as many different types of hairstyles using the same hair chunks. So you don't need to redo that every time.
Yeah.
So I reuse a lot of hair chunks for my projects, for sure.
That makes complete sense. Would you ever consider selling your hair chunks?
Maybe, yeah. I haven't thought about it, but yeah.
He brought it up, and I was like, you know what? That's an interesting, you know, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
We could talk about that side business later, Johan.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, Piranha wants to know, how difficult is it to preview hair this way working in Maya? Because if this is for Unreal, you know, 4, your hair in the viewport looks white. Wouldn't that be confusing to the artist grooming the hair? What's your workaround for this?
So, I mean, the way that the hair looks in Maya is purely based on your texture that you're using. So what I tend to do to just visualize it a bit better, because as I mentioned, I don't really think about shading when I make it in Maya. But it's still nice to have that sense of depth to the hair, because that's super important, you know, for your final product. So what I tend to do is just make a separate texture that I use only for Maya, which is basically the height map combined with the alpha channel. So that way, and also I make the height map, parts of the height map rather, a little bit darker for cards that I know are going to be used for like the blockouts. And then some of the flyaways, I make them a bit brighter. So when I actually place the different layers, I get a better visualization of, you know, what I'm working on in Maya. But then, as I said, like, a lot of these things when it comes to shading is going to be so vastly different that in Unreal Engine that, you know, you might as well just go flat shading. Think about the volumes, think about the silhouettes, all of that stuff instead when you make the assets.
Makes sense. And we've had this question asked a few times, so kill a few birds here. How would you go about making braids? Any tips?
Yeah, so braids, it's a bit of a tricky one because it's kind of the same thing when you make dreadlocks. Once again, it's always going to shade depending on how your geometry looks. And braids themselves have a very complicated looking shape to them, which, you know, to perfectly recreate the shape of a braid, you need a lot of polygons, which doesn't necessarily work. So you just try to create something where the low poly kind of fits as closely as possible to your generated xgen hairs. So I typically start off by actually making a braid in xgen. And then I make a low poly, just like a small part of it, of the entire braid, with like a tileable low poly. And then I tile both the geometry of the low poly, but also the texture. So you can basically have any sort of length for your braid. using just a small piece of texture, so you don't run into issues where the hairs look different from the hairs on your on the rest of the head.
Cool. Is there any prereqs? Steve wants to know: is there any prereqs for joining your course in terms of skill level?
I mean, we're not really going to cover a lot of Maya stuff. Like, even if the course is, I would like to say, pretty extensive, we still have a set amount of time. So there's a ton of information out there when it comes to like learning Maya. Where's all the buttons and stuff. So we don't really cover that stuff. It's more like you're already comfortable using Maya. You probably have created a couple of characters. You have had a go at making hair, and you just want to try to take it to the next level. So you don't need to be like a industry veteran by any means to join the course, but you need to have like a basic understanding of the softwares that we're going to use, because that's not really covered. It's more about the mindset that I have when I make the assets and the workflow specifically tied to hair.
Cool. And since we were talking about a little bit of different styles, how would you go about doing a buzz cut hairstyle?
A buzz cut it's tricky again, because there's like depending on what you're going to use it for, it depends a lot on how you go by creating it. For like a low-end NPC, for basically any sort of game, you're not really going to see it super up close. There's not going to be like dialogue scenes where you stare into the character's face, so you can study each individual element, all the details. I would probably just like bake it onto a texture on the scalp. Easy, done. For something like a hero character, for a high-end game, I would probably just create it the same way I would create, for instance, the beard. Let's see here.
Which is great, because someone was, we had a few questions regarding long beard hairstyles.
Yeah, so, and it's, roughly the same type of workflow. I'm also using the chunk workflow to make the beard, but instead of using 3 and 4 cards for each chunk, I'm only using 2. And I would probably do the same thing for when I make the buzz cuts. I would just do a couple of really short hairs. I wouldn't really put them on a very wide card, so I would rather make like a little bit tighter, so that then I could have 2 cards, intersect with each other, add a bit of that variation to the normals, and then just place those on the model.
Cool. And that would probably be the same approach if you're doing like, let's just say like a lion's mane, right? If you're doing something like,
Yeah, for sure. Like fur, any type of fur, really.
Yeah.
I've used this workflow for basically all types of hair. You need to adjust it depending on what you're going to use it for, the complexity, all of that stuff. But in the end, it's just a way to make something that feels like a volume. That's basically the gist of it.
Cool. And Tarek wants to know what software you're using for baking spline output.
So I'm baking using XNormal, and I'm using a Maya plugin called, was it Simple Pipe, I think? If you just Google Simple Pipe, there's, I think, the first option on the website. That's going to be where you download it. It's from High-End 3D. It's a free plugin. Basically just enables you to convert a broader selection of splines into geometries.
Cool. Like I love High-End 3D. There's just so many useful things there.
Yeah, for sure. I have a bunch of scripts from there. Definitely.
Cool. And James wants to know, actually, we already answered that question. Alice wants to know, have you used NVIDIA's Hairwork? And if so, what do you think about it?
I actually haven't used that for any of the projects that I've been working on. We did use a version of TressFX for Horizon. So we basically rewrote it, did our own kind of version of it. Interestingly enough, one of the projects that I'm working on currently is for AMD with TressFX. So I can't really talk a lot about it. They told me I could say that I'm doing it.
Okay.
But we have some really cool stuff lined up that hopefully should be shown sometime next year.
Cool.
So that's something to look forward to.
Great. And Jeff wants to know, do you have any advice for making hair models that need to be compatible with hats or helmets?
I'd say skip the hats if that's not an option. I mean, I guess whatever makes sense, right? You can't really do something where the hair penetrates the hats. So you need to restrict yourself to do geometry that's supposed to be on top of it. I really do feel like it's time to move away from the hats. Like, I want to start a movement. no more forced hats in games, please. Unless it's like Team Fortress, awesome looking, funny hats.
Yeah.
No hats. We can make hair great again.
That's the slogan. Making hair great again. All right, cool. So Renee wants to know, do you make a hair preview of reference in Zbrush or xgen first before you start making the hair cards?
It's a good question, because that's something that I did when I was researching how to make better looking hair, like back when I was working at Gorilla. Gorilla. It's not typically something I do anymore because it does take a lot of time, probably as much time as you would spend on actually making the actual hair assets, the in-game one. So unless you're working on like a really big project and you really need like a good benchmark for the studio, I would probably recommend it. But other than that, no, I don't do that.
Okay, cool. And Vincent and a couple people have asked, can we see the layers for the long hair, please?
I actually don't have it here, but I do have, let's see here.
And while you're
hair layering example.
Okay, cool. And okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is this is the blockout. This is the second layer. So this one is a little bit more complex, so I actually ended up using 4 layers for it. What I ended up doing is I just split the flyaways into 2 layers because I just needed a layer where the details weren't quite big enough to be in the second layer, but they weren't small enough to be in the flyaways. So this is the second layer. This is the third layer. You can see here as well. This is the third layer. Sorry, this is second layer, third layer, and then flyaways on top here.
Cool. And how much? What's the poly count for some of the individual cards?
So, I mean, personally, if you spend a lot of time making something that's supposed to look really nice, have a lot of shape to it, you know, it's the worst thing if you do your, you know, close-up render of your character and you start seeing kinks in the texture. So what I typically do is, like, nowadays I've done it enough times where I kind of know how many subdivisions I want for each chunk, but I basically just make sure that when I have it kind of chest up, which is probably the most important distance from the camera, because that's like the conversation dialogue distance in games. You know, that's when your asset is supposed to shine, right? So you don't want any kinks and texture from that distance. So I just add enough where you can't really see the kink. Do note that, you know, you can add subdivisions where you have shape, and then if you don't have shape, you don't really need a lot of subdivisions. So say that this is my final chunk, right? I can actually go in and just delete these. That one. That one doesn't really add a lot of value. And then I can just go in and add some extra ones here. You just make sure you do it evenly. And that's pretty much the density of a hair chunk.
Cool. Antenos wants to know what's the average, what's your resolution? At what resolution do you usually bake your hair cards?
I bake them at 4K, and then in game it's typically 2K.
Okay, great. And Michelle wants to know, well, actually, just in you're in class, do you cover the different steps, including export to UE?
Yeah, okay, definitely. Like the whole, I might not cover like how to rig the hair because that's super individual to your pipeline, to your studio, all of that stuff. But in the course, we cover everything from reference gathering all the way to having a final product in Unreal Engine. And we also give out this Unreal scene, so you can just use this if you want to, make your renders in there with the shading, the lighting, all of that stuff.
Cool. So yeah, could you give us an overview of your course and what that covers?
Yeah, sure.
Just a brief overview.
I mean, I've tried to explain the overall workflow as much as I can during this 1.5 hour. But obviously, since we have a lot more time, it's a little bit more in-depth. For instance, we start off with doing hair theory. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I only look at real-life images for reference. And I try to incorporate different features of these images into my model. And there's a lot of stuff when it comes to that we cover in the course. So yeah, just hair theory, I guess. The whole process of creating this model has obviously been recorded. So, as we create the model, I just speak about each individual step and try to explain it as much as possible. We go through some photoshopping of the textures. We go through the rendering stages as well, how to make a nice render, what to think about, how to break up the specular, where to do it, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, we basically try to take you from having little experience making hair into eventually creating something that hopefully looks pretty nice and you can use in your portfolio.
Yep, we've had actually several students that have gotten jobs after taking your class. So it's definitely a testament to the quality of instruction that you're going to get in this class. So, and for everyone, we have the link to Johan's class as a sticky as part of the chat. So unfortunately, it's we're going to have to cut it here. I know there's tons of questions that we weren't able to get to. But first off, I'd like to say, Johan, thank you so much for taking an hour and a half, of your weekend, especially considering the fact that yesterday was your birthday. You're supposed to be sleeping in and not having to deal with this stuff. But thank you so much for taking the time. There you go. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your amazing wealth of knowledge, with the audience. And obviously, thank you guys for attending. This has been an amazing session, and obviously, it's not possible without the great questions that you guys have. So, and thank you for spending your weekend with us, as well. So, we have several more of these sessions planned. I believe the next one is with Jay Machado, who's a senior modeling supervisor at ILM. And then after that, we have Gael, who is senior creature artist at MPC, I believe, and a few other amazing, webinars lined up. So Thank you so much, guys. Johan, thank you again.
Thank you so much, guys, for coming here. It's been awesome.
Cool. And everybody, it's have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys next week.
All right. See you guys. Thank you.